And please feel free to sit in the front here. There's a wonderful row, which is actually for our members, but if not enough members show up, well, then these seats are for you. All right, so good afternoon. Welcome, everyone. My name is Sophia Russak, and this is the second event that we're organizing in our little mini European Parliament election series. And last time we talked about the far-right surge, or rise, I should rather say. By the way, if you're interested in watching that, it's still online on our event site, also on YouTube. So today, I guess we will also touch upon the far-right. But our focus will be a little bit wider in a way. I would like to kind of touch upon three things, three baskets of topics. And the first one is the European Parliament's internal dynamics, as in which actors were decisive in the last term and what can we expect from the next term. The second basket is transparency and corruption. What has happened since Quatargate, and is it enough? And lastly, the interinstitutional dynamics, the lead candidates, the campaigns, and if we have time, a little bit of an outlook what will happen after the elections. And to discuss these things, we have with us two of three speakers. The third one is going to arrive in a minute. So we have Eddie Wax, politics reporter from Politico, and I'm pretty sure that most of you, including me, are following very closely his special playbook every Friday, which he drafts only on the EP elections. So thanks a lot for this. It's always very helpful. And then we have Klaus Welle with us. He is the former Secretary General of the European Parliament for, I think, 13 years. So knows the institution inside out. Thanks a lot for both of you for being here today. And then the last speaker, as you can see, Sophie Infeld. She is a member of the European Parliament, currently for Renew, but at the moment she's campaigning to sit with Volt in the next term. All right, one more thing to you. So I would like to, instead of tying in your questions all at the end, I would like to do this like throughout the debate so that we can target a little bit better the topics that we talk about right now, so that you know and can be prepared when I open the floor. But you will be able to ask questions at multiple points. All right. Well, maybe since Sophie is not there yet, would you like to tell us a little bit how you saw the internal dynamics, the internal decision dynamics of the European Parliament in the last term?
Yeah, so of course, the first part of this I could observe a little bit more closely because I was still in function as Secretary General until end of 2022. Since then, I'm not. But of course, there are also scientific publications about this. One very recently, very good, has been published by the Delors Institute. And that tells us that about 2/3 of the winning alliances in Parliament were what I would call the super big coalition, so EPP, Socialist, Liberal. One could also call it the system stabilizing majority, because these are the parties that are there when qualified majorities need to be produced. That can be the election of a commission president, that can be enlargement decisions, that can be the vote of a commission president, because they need a qualified majority. So this has been kind of the standard. And then you had, in a lesser case, somewhere between 10 and 20%, a winning majority on the left, including the Liberals, which is called the progressive majority, and also a little bit more than 10% a winning coalition on the very right, let's say the EPP and to the right of it. If I understand it correctly, one would need to go more into detail. These have been rather, let's say, negative votes. So when, for example, on climate change, the EPP was not happy, what is to the right of the EPP surely was not happy, then there was a negative vote produced. So it's quite symmetrical. The majority case of application still is this super big coalition or the system stabilizing majority, and then kind of equal deviations to the left, but that could be a positive majority, but in some cases also to the very right, but rather as one to avoid that decisions were taken.
Can you tell us a little bit how you see the role of the EPP in the next term? Is the EPP gonna be a decisive actor more than it was?
I mean, if we take opinion polls seriously, for example, from Politico, and of course we should take them seriously, I guess, then we are going to see additional seats on the right. The dimension exactly has to be judged. It was even up to 55 seats. On the left, minus 40 seats because Parliament is growing by 15. I think those figures are now a little bit going lower. But one of the I think there are two consequences. One is that the possibility to have this kind of progressive majority from liberals to communists included is becoming less likely. So the possibility to outvote the EPP on legislative votes is decreasing if that's going to happen. And the second is that for the first time, if I know the figures correctly, since direct elections in 1979, the space from, let's say, GUE, so the left or the communist group, to the liberals included, could be clearly less than 50%. So could be 45%, 46%, 47%. And that means that the decisive vote in this parliament could be sitting in the EPP group and not in the Renew group as in the last parliament potentially.
Eddie, how do you see things, and how do you think that this might affect also the next policy agenda of the EU?
Well, I think that the Parliament doesn't have the right to initiate legislation, so that's a key difference between the European Parliament and the national parliaments. It's more of a kind of gatekeeper role that it has. So it really matters more who's sitting around the European Council table, and we are seeing more right-wing, far-right politicians there. We've got Meloni, we've got Fiala in Czech Republic, possibly at least someone who's governing with Wilders in the Netherlands. So that's important, and it's part of a whole system of European institutions. I do think that the EPP at least wants to play this kind of kingmaker role in the next parliament. It's clear that they've been frustrated over the last 2 to 3 years with having to having to swallow the fact that there has been this progressive majority possible. That's not to say that the progressive majority has won out in every single vote. But the fact that the Greens sometimes joined in and created a coalition with the Socialists and the Liberals, going around EPP has not pleased them. So there's now a kind of backlash, an EPP backlash, I think, and they're going to revel in having this more decisive role potentially in the next parliament. That obviously, in order to do that, that's why we're seeing for the last more than a year certain people in the EPP reaching out to parts of the ECR. And the rhetoric and the language that people like Ursula von der Leyen have been using on that question of are you going to do deals with the far right, with sections of the far right, has certainly changed. I mean, she did a very strange press conference in the European Parliament, which is rare for a Commission president to be doing a press conference in the European Parliament. That was months ago, way before she was even confirmed as the Spitzenkandidat, and she was talking about the parliamentary majorities, which I think is odd. It's not normal that a Commission president talks about how am I going to get votes in the next parliament. So that should be the role for someone like Manfred Weber. So it's clearly a question that's on the top of their minds. And obviously the key vote is the first vote that probably she will face if she is nominated by the council. And we don't even know when that will be, July, September, but sometime later this year. And she needs to get to that figure of 361 votes. She needs to have a majority of the MEPs confirming her.
So before I'm going to ask you a bit more about the left side of the political spectrum, but also welcome, Sophie, and ask you in a bit of the role of Renew. Allow me one very nerdy institutional question, because you said right of initiative. And Klaus, she had announced, she is Ursula von der Leyen, in her speech that she gave to the parliament right before the vote, that she will respect the parliament's indirect vote of initiative. What did she?
When when candidates need a qualified majority in parliament, that's the moment of maximum political influence of the European Parliament. And that concerns politics, that concerns people, and that concerns also institutional arrangements. And Parliament over the last legislatures has developed this in a more and more skillful way. And the last time, one of the possibilities of Ursula von der Leyen to compensate for the fact that she was not a Spitzenkandidat was to promise to Parliament that she, if Parliament votes a legislative own initiative report with a qualified majority in plenary, she would make that proposal. When I've been leaving function end of 2022, according to my count, there were 16 procedures on the way, and on every single procedure, the Commission was on track, with one exception, which was the budget, because Parliament had asked that the MFF, the Commission would make a new proposal for the MFF. The Commission was very unwilling to do that, but it was rescued by time, because finally Parliament and the Council agreed on a new MFF.
And the kind of Commission action was also to the satisfaction of the Parliament?
At the time, I'd asked the services whether they fulfill their obligations, and the answer was yes.
Sophie, I bet you also want to comment on that one, but also maybe one step back. So the last term was the first one after the end of the what we call the Grand Coalition, right? For the whole of the existence of the European Parliament, we saw that the two biggest group always had 50% of the seats or more. That ended in 2019. And that made, I mean, we sat in conference rooms like this one and elsewhere a lot in 2019 talking about the new term and that Renew will be somewhat like a kingmaker, right? So now 5 years later, the question is, of course, could Renew fulfill this role?
Well, not as much as it could have done, I think. But maybe one step back, because there's one thing that Klaus Welle said that I agree with, namely that the moment of the confirmation vote, or just moments before the confirmation vote of the Commission President, are the moments where the European Parliament actually has power, has leverage. And I have to say that in 2019, Parliament failed spectacularly to use that leverage. And indeed, Ursula von der Leyen made lots of promises. And then we found out after the vote that apparently there was a lot of small print and footnotes that had been overlooked by some people, because I have to say that the 16 legislative initiative reports that you refer to had escaped my attention. They were probably concerning small technical things, but when it comes about the big political issues, the European Commission has simply ignored the requests of the European Parliament. I'm thinking of random selection. We called for legislation in the area of golden passports, spyware. We called for a revision of the statute of EPO. We've been calling for strengthening of the annual rule of law report, and this is all just in my area of the Civil Liberties Committee. So all the political topics, the European Commission has just ignored Parliament, and it's also very clear that Ursula von der Leyen is not the biggest fan of parliamentary democracy, accountability, and transparency. But okay, it's for her to convince the next European Parliament that that is going to change completely in the next 5 years. But I do think that the European Parliament has to understand what its role is. And over the last 5 years in particular, Parliament has been a very good legislator, but it's been lousy as a democratic watchdog. It has not held the Commission to account. It has not given sufficient counterweight to the European Council, which is overstepping its powers the whole time. So that has to change in the next 5 years.
But how do you see the role of Renew within the European Parliament?
I think Renew has been too. Renew should have taken the lead in, Parliament becoming this parliamentary watchdog or playing that role. And I'm afraid to say that Renew has actually done the opposite. Too often, there have been, cozy compromise. For example, the issue of the text messages with the CEO of Pfizer. Then, I mean, for me as a Democrat, it would have been normal for the Commission President to appear before the plenary of the European Parliament. And yet my own group tried to make an agreement with EPP and S&D to have this session in camera in the Conference of Presidents. I mean, that's not the kind of role I would expect from the Liberal group.
Let's look a little bit on the left side of the spectrum. So the S&D is not. It looks like it's losing, but if you take Brexit into account, it's actually not, right? Or not much. Renew is losing. The Greens are losing. Eddie, what do you think? Like, why are the Greens losing? Why were they not able to kind of capitalize on this, green euphoria that we had 5 years ago?
Well, there's different opinions on that. Some people say they pushed too fast and they asked for too much. And there are lots of new green laws that are extremely binding and are now set in stone. So they could be happy about that. But I mean, it's not only down to what the Greens have done and haven't done. I mean, there have been huge world crises, wars, pandemics that have changed the political kind of compass in Brussels, and that provided a lot of fodder as well for parties that were never particularly that keen about the Green Deal. For example, the EPP, who were already, during the pandemic, they were calling for a lot of, I used to cover agriculture, so they were calling for the farm to fork strategy, which is part of the Green Deal, to be stripped back and reversed and rethought. And then the same arguments were used when Ukraine, was invaded by Russia, and that did obviously create real sort of difficulties on the agricultural markets because Ukraine's such a big exporter. So it's a combination of, the Greens potentially, maybe they have been too ambitious. They would probably say they haven't been ambitious enough. There are people in the Greens who are asking for much more ambitious climate legislation, saying we can't slow down. But yeah, the fact is that some parties were lying in wait. They really didn't want to have the Green Deal, and it's been very interesting to see Ursula von der Leyen kind of metamorphizing into into someone who hasn't created the Green Deal. I mean, that is her, to date, that is her biggest legacy. That's if she was not to come back to Brussels after this summer, she would be remembered, I think, primarily for that, also for the response on Ukraine's invasion. But she's now, as part of the EPP, she's now having to present herself as someone who's going to be kind of hawkish, who's going to be big on topics like foreign affairs, on security, and on, like competition and industry policy.
Quick one, how likely is it that she's not returning? What do you think?
How likely? Well, it all matters about that 361 number, and I don't think it's ever happened before, but it's a secret vote, and there's going to be a lot of deal making and lots of private conversations that she and her team are going to be having with politicians, lots of deals behind closed doors. But I think one interesting thing is the calendar. I mean, it could happen in July. Technically, it's up to the political groups to decide whether to put that vote on the agenda. If she needs more time, they might delay it till September.
What do you think? Are they going to delay it to September? Because I was quite sure, because I was thinking, what would be the motivation of the political groups to squeeze it into the July session? But I also saw that there's another plenary day now added to the calendar. So what do you think?
I wouldn't call it a delay because the election of the Commission President is normally happening in the second plenary session. In the first plenary session, Parliament is sorting out its own functions. So it has to constitute its bureau, quaestors, committee chairs. All of this is quite time consuming. And normally even the committee chairs need already the second session. I understand, I don't know, because I'm no longer there, that now the committees will be constituted already in the first plenary session of July. And then the second plenary session could be for the Commission, but that plenary session is in September. And by the way, I don't think this has to be a disadvantage, by the way, for both sides. For the candidate, it doesn't have to be a disadvantage because I think she will need to discuss very much in detail, as you have said, what should be done over the next 5 years, because she needs this majority, which will be more difficult than last time because the system stabilizing center is shrinking and Parliament is growing. So if she had last time a majority of 8 or 9, her starting point now is in the negative. So she will need that time to discuss. And equally, political groups, including her own political group, will want to know whom they are supporting and what kind of policy agenda they are supporting. And that cannot be rushed. That needs to be discussed in detail. And therefore, I think September is no problem, and September is not a delay. The second session is the normal procedure.
Feel free to step in anytime if you have something to add, right? And also you. Is anybody already ready for a question? I know this comes as a surprise now, but yeah, Wouter. Wait, I'm just gonna, yeah. Could you maybe show yours? Yes, perfect. And by the way, guys, there are still seats here. You don't have to stand. So if you dare, because everybody watches you now, there are 3 just in the very front row here, and I see at least 2, 3 others in the second row here. Okay, Wouter.
Thank you so much. Wouter Wolfs, University of Leuven. Building on what you just said, there is now talk about a more detailed coalition agreement that needs to be negotiated at the beginning of the mandate between the parliamentary groups and the EC president. It was already the case in 2019, a bit of a framework agreement with Ursula von der Leyen. The question is it a good idea to go into a detailed coalition agreement for the groups? On the short term, I see the added value for S&D and the Greens and Renew, because they want to be part of this package. But from the experience of the national level, this could backfire. A coalition agreement is institutionalizing this majority, formal majority. And at national level, we've seen that a grand coalition, as we know at European level, often results in increased results for electoral results for challenger parties, far right, far left. Secondly, is my last point, interinstitutionally, detailed and long coalition agreements tend to lead to weak parliaments. And the question is, can the institutional position of the European Parliament be affected? Can a coalition agreement be the chain that limits the possibilities of the EP as a watchdog, basically? Thank you.
Sophie.
Yeah, no, I entirely agree with you. Besides, you can have a very detailed agreement and then, you know, the world decides otherwise, as we have seen over the last 5 years. I mean, as they say, predictions are always very difficult, in particular when they're about the future. But I do think what we do need is an agreement which is set in stone about the relationship between the European Commission and Parliament. Because I think that has been the biggest failure of Parliament over the last 5 years. And it will come back to haunt us in the years to come. And I think there should be very detailed and binding arrangements, no footnotes, no exemptions about accountability and transparency. Things like, you know, I think there should at least once a month be a proper question hour. Mrs. von der Leyen should commit to full transparency, including the cases which are on the table right now, things like the text messages, but also full information about the decisions that have been taken regarding the Article 7 and the release of funds in the case of Hungary and Poland. Full transparency, and there are a few more issues like that. And I'd also, you know, sometimes it's good if certain things are not laid down in the treaties, because that means that they're not explicitly banned. And I would suggest that the European Parliament also, you know, when it does its confirmation vote at the start of the mandate, it should already set a date midterm for a kind of, you know, refreshing the marriage vows. A kind of, so not, because if you, the Parliament can table a motion of censure against the Commission, but that's very, very difficult. But if you simply say, okay, we already fixed the date for a renewal of our confirmation vote, then you'll keep the Commission on its toes for at least 2.5 years. And I think finally there should be very clear arrangements for indeed this right of initiative, no more footnotes. If Parliament adopts a legislative initiative report, the Commission has to put forward a proposal, full stop. Because I think there is such an imbalance. You know, now we see Commission President von der Leyen basically ignoring, well, the more political legislative initiatives. On the other hand, the Commission never puts forward anymore a proposal before having consulted all the 27 governments, which is, you know, they're two equal legislators, but the Commission has forgotten, and that has to be restored.
You're very ambitious on accountability, but most other MEPs are not, right? I mean, not even the question hour. Yeah, I mean, it's true, not even the question hour. I remember under Barroso, there was a question hour, nobody was there. I mean, I don't have the feeling that MEPs are much interested in looking back and rather in, you know, shaping, creating policy.
I know, but if others are less ambitious, that's not a reason for me to be less ambitious, quite the opposite, actually. And if we're serious, because we are looking at the state of democracy and the rule of law in member states, in countries outside the European Union. Everybody is worried about the rise of extremist parties. I mean, how can we then say, oh, but we have no ambitions about democracy, about accountability? And we seem to think that the treaties are a kind of, you know, I call this like a menu in a Greek restaurant. If you can't find something you like, then you'll just ask the cook to prepare something that's not on the menu. The treaties are the constitutional framework within which the institutions have to operate. I think that's something that we need to be more mindful of.
Right, Eddie,
when it comes to binding the Parliament, making the Commission more accountable to the Parliament, and binding those two institutions together. I mean, Renew, maybe not the part of Renew that you're representing, but when it comes to the European elections and things like that, I mean, the French Renaissance MEPs, the French part of Renew, has been extremely weak and has basically let down your side of the argument on that, because they have totally, you know, made a mockery of the Spitzenkandidat process. They've never been behind it. They weren't behind it 5 years ago. They're not behind it now, and that is a very understandable way for many people to see how, you know, something happens with the elections, then something happens in the Commission.
But I agree, and I just said, and I mean, we also have to be self-critical, and yes, I agree, and I said it before, I don't think that Renew has played the role it should have played. An interesting development just in the last 2 hours or so is that the French have now said that they don't want the Dutch VVD party in the group anymore, which is, you know, that's interesting because it's not just about one party, and the reason is that they're in a coalition with the far right in the Netherlands. But that means that, you know, the dynamics are changing, and that would give an opportunity to maybe get a real reshuffle of the political landscape within the European Parliament, and create, because now you see, let's say, pro-European, centrist, liberal force, I mean, you know, liberal in the broad sense of the word, across the political groups. And I mean, there may be some people in the EPP who are feeling increasingly uneasy about the new friendships struck by Weber and von der Leyen. So, you know, if we have a new centrist, progressive, liberal, pro-European group, might be attractive.
On the coalition agreement, Eddie or Klaus, do you would like to step in on that?
Yeah, maybe maybe let me first comment on two, I think, open issues. The one you were speaking about, Renew. But the problem is that there are still 3 parties forming Renew. Yeah. The Renew group, they didn't manage to consolidate that alliance with Macron. Why? Because liberal in France is a bad word. If you call yourself liberal, you still make it between 1 and 2% of the vote. I know it because there was a démocratie libérale in the past, and that was, you know, the usual thing. So there is a consolidation issue in the Renew group. It grew, but it didn't manage to consolidate this over the last 5 years. And on your question, because your question was, should there be a coalition agreement? I think the European Parliament is stronger than national parliaments, and I wouldn't like to see the European Parliament developing into a national parliament. But in order to do a coalition agreement and negotiate that, and there were some attempts last time, you need to know who is ready to vote the Commission President. And last time the Greens dropped out the evening before. And by the way, the Greens did not vote the last 4 Commission Presidents. The recommendation was negative on von der Leyen, even though she proposed the Green Deal. They didn't vote Jean-Claude Juncker, they didn't vote Barroso, they didn't vote Barroso 1. So if one wanted to do this, could be between EPP, Socialist, Liberals, but if it were to go beyond, then the Greens would need to clearly commit that they want to be part of that majority next time.
If my memory serves me right, there was a substantial number of German EPP that didn't vote Mrs. von der Leyen either. Yeah. So, you know, right. I always wondered what this coalition was about.
We don't have coalitions in the European Parliament. We have broad agreements, but you know, if cohesion in votes is 90%, that's good.
Ad hoc formations. Anybody else at this point? Yes, please, in the first row.
Hi, thank you, Natalie from Freshfields. I had a question. I thought it was very interesting what you said about the Parliament needing to realise the power that it has in its hands, you know, on the brink of a confirmatory vote. My question is, when you have such a large turnover, which we saw just before COVID, and the impact that that has had on committees getting up and running, on all sorts of different aspects of the life of the European Parliament, of course not aided by a pandemic in the middle, but we're expecting a similar level of turnover this time. How do you think that affects, you need a sort of institutional awareness, whether it's as a house, as a bloc, or whether it's, you know, amongst groups, but how do you get to a point with such a large turnover expected that you're pulling in the same direction, that there's a common understanding of what the house or the group is trying to do? Isn't that very, how do you see that essentially?
And we're talking about 60% again, right? By the way, I had the exact same question in mind, so.
I don't think that there is a silver bullet here, because I mean, you cannot tell the public, look, you have to vote for this or that person because they have experience. But I do think one of the reasons, and some of you may have seen, I've written a few small booklets about particularly this topic. I think the problem we had in 2019 was the you know, the addition of a very large turnover, which affected the groups differently, by the way. The Renew group was made up 75% of new members, and the EPP 41 group. That makes a big difference. But so large turnover, meaning that a lot of institutional memory disappeared. That was you know, compounded by Brexit. Our British colleagues left and took with them this very strong parliamentary tradition, you know, that very tough scrutiny and debate. Then, of course, we were hit by COVID. I mean, just when everybody had found their ways to the pigeonholes in the toilets, then we were locked up in our homes for 2 years. So all of that meant that, you know, the parliament could never sort of I mean, people didn't get to know each other. And if you want to act as one institution, then you have to know each other. You have to be in the same room. And I also noticed it in the last couple of months, let's say since January, that much more than any of the previous terms, colleagues were absent during the votes, during the debates. I mean, the last 2 months or so, it was near to impossible to find MEPs for votes in committees. And that was really, you know, very remarkably higher than in previous terms. So apparently the connection that they made with the parliament they were a member of for 5 years was less strong than in the previous term. So I can only hope, I'm not sure if there's going to be another 60% turnover. Huh?
That is
I think
less.
less.
It's of course difficult also to calculate, right? And quite a difficult job, no? I mean, how do you calculate? You take all the lists and then you take the polling.
It's a probability,
anyway.
But I do think that having this institutional memory is essential for any parliament, and the European Parliament maybe even more than a national one.
Right, Klaus?
Yeah, I think it's a very, very good point you're making, and absolutely correct for the last legislature. But I would go maybe one step further, and this is that let's say we had members in the past who first and foremost engaged for the institution. And even their own government, you know, didn't have a big impact on them. If I think of Martin Schulz and Joseph Daul pushing through the Spitzenkandidaten, even though it was highly unpopular in the European Council. And we've seen that governments are learning. They underestimated Parliament 2014 with the Spitzenkandidaten 2019. I would say they executed strong pressure, let's formulate it carefully, on the leadership of both the Socialist group and the Liberal group. Even before Parliament was constituted, decisions were taken. I asked myself, how could they be taken? Because Parliament was even constituted to not go for Spitzenkandidaten. That wouldn't have happened with Joseph Daul and Martin Schulz. That's absolutely clear. But also to say something positive, because I think we shouldn't leave you in a depressed state of the European Parliament. I've seen that David Sassoli was one of the major forces behind Next Generation EU as a president. He did a big impact, had a big impact there. I think Parliament had a big impact also that the Green Deal came about at the beginning of this legislature in the different talks group leaders had with the incoming Commission president. And on Ukraine, I think this Parliament clearly was in a lead position. Ursula von der Leyen was the first president to be in Kiev when it was still attacked. Parliament in a resolution asked for membership negotiations with Ukraine, first institutions. So I think the point can also be made that even though these circumstances were much more difficult, and I'm in full agreement, because, you know, members passed a lot of time behind screens under their roof and were not in the plenary during this legislature, Parliament, I think, left a decisive mark on EU politics.
You touched upon the lead candidates, so let's talk about this a little bit. It seems that nobody's really believing it anymore in the third round, although it is, yeah. You are, exactly, this is why the first question goes to you, because you are allegedly one of the inventors of this process. But I mean, it's happening, right? I mean, parties are appointing candidates. It's true that Renew is playing again, you know, an ambiguous game, but the campaigns are, well, lukewarm, but they're happening. The debates are happening. Today is a debate at Brügge on Thursday, organized by the EBU and the Parliament. So you could argue it's happening. What is your take on it in the third round?
Yeah, I was accused in May 2014 by the Financial Times to have been the devious mind behind the Spitzenkandidaten process. I had a half-page portrait. But of course, there were many devious minds, not just me, but I was one of the devious minds, and I'm proud about it, because at least it serves that people who want to run the Commission have to present themselves to the voters, and maybe they're learning something. You know, need to get a feel of how people are thinking. But in 2014, it worked because the candidate was acceptable both for the European Parliament and for the European Council. We are a two-chamber system. We are not a simple parliamentary democracy. And he was the most left-leaning Christian Democrat possible, Jean-Claude Juncker. So you have to be electable on both sides of the aisle. Center-right has to be electable center-left. Center-left candidate has to be center-right. 2014, that was the case. 2019, it wasn't the case. It was made a bit too easy. Of course, governments had a big incentive to destroy it, but it's coming back. It's very well alive, and we are going to see. So reports about Spitzenkandidates' early deaths are exaggerated. I think the problem is now somewhere else. This time the question is the system stabilizing center in the parliament, and for me that's EPP, Socialists and Liberals, are they still able to produce a qualified majority, yes or no? And my answer is rather no. And that then is asking the question, where to can it be extended? Because otherwise, I don't think it will be this time the European Council that could stop it, but it could be the European Parliament.
Eddie, how meaningful is the lead candidate procedure in 2024?
It's dead, definitely dead. It died in 2019, I'm afraid, because you said that at least the lead candidate has to present themselves. The Commission President has to present herself to the people. Didn't happen. We've had a Commission President for 5 years who has barely presented herself to the people, at all, and not to journalists, and has done not very many media appearances, not many press conferences for the last 5 years. So she's been a very guarded Commission President, and she's been a very guarded and secretive Commission President from the very beginning. She didn't have, she didn't have to do a campaign tour. Now she's doing a campaign tour, having been pressured into it by the EPP, which was totally silent for a month after she was, nominated as the only candidate in Bucharest at the Congress. And she didn't do any campaigning from that point. She's retained the full powers of being Commission President during this whole period. So, and that's just reason number one. I mean, what the Spitzenkandidat process has now become, and I'm not saying whether I think that's a good thing or not, but what it has actually become now is kind of a general jobs race, a general flinging of your hat into a sort of pile in the middle of the room in Brussels, where people are going for different jobs. I mean, Nicola Schmidt is just going after any kind of job that he can get. He's not going to become the Commission President. He may not even become Luxembourg's commissioner. I mean, his party is out of government now in Luxembourg. And there is another candidate, there's Christoph Hansen, who is a former MEP, who's probably first in line there. So he's looking for any kind of job. You've got the three liberal candidates who have explicitly said at their congress in Brussels, we are not Spitzenkandidaten, we are running to be MEPs. And then you've got the two Greens, who, by the way, there are two of them, so how can they both be Commission President? And everyone knows they're not going to be Commission President anyway, even if there was only one of them. I mean, it's actually coming round, the tail of the Spitzenkandidat process is coming round to eat itself. because you're now getting yourself into a situation where on Thursday the Parliament is going to host the debate. It's the Eurovision debate, and it's actually presenting a skewed image of, because they are applying the Spitzenkandidat process so rigorously to this debate, which is happening in the Parliament, presumably under the pressure of the Parliament itself. They are excluding the ECR and the ID candidates from running. Well, the ECR doesn't have a candidate, but I'm sure that if
there's
it was
one that's debating.
well, that's
He's a
that's
non-lead
ID.
candidate, lead candidate.
There's a Danish MEP from ID who wants to go to the debate, but so we're going to have a debate in the Parliament where legitimately these far-right parties, you might not agree with them, but they have a right to be heard. They're going to be excluded from taking part in the debate, and this is ahead of an election where we are going to see most likely a more right-wing parliament. So we're going to be having a sort of the liberal coalition, the liberal left-wing coalition, debating against each other weeks before an election where the whole thing's going to go rightward. So how is the Spitzenkandidat process? How is applying the Spitzenkandidat process so rigorously there actually doing anything when they're not going to, it's not going to decide who's the Commission president, and it's presenting a weird view of what politics is actually happening right now.
Has ECR and ID, have they been excluded, or did they voluntarily not participate?
I think from what I understand and what I've written the last couple of weeks, ID is being excluded, and ECR hasn't presented a Spitzenkandidat and is not, as far as I'm aware, trying to take part in the debate.
Sophie?
I'm a bit in between Klaus and Eddie, because no, I don't think the process is in great shape, but it may not be dead and buried just yet, because I think it is, there is always one misconception. The Spitzenkandidat is not about citizens electing the president of the European Commission. That's not the case. There's only one question at stake. Is it the European Parliament or the European Council who determines who's going to be the next president of the Commission? That's the only question. And there, I think Parliament messed up badly in 2019, indeed, because the governments had learned, also because the French were all of a sudden much more dominant because of Renew, because of Brexit, because of a number of reasons. And, I love France, no mistake about it. Music, Camembert, lovely country. The one thing that France does not have is parliamentary democracy. And they do not believe, they have never, from day one, believed in parliamentary Europe. I mean, you can go all the way back to the origins of the European Union. They were always opposed to the parliamentary dimension of the European Union. So, for them, intergovernmental Europe and government leaders deciding amongst each other what's going to happen, that's the way they conceive Europe. And I think, indeed, it is very unfortunate that Ursula von der Leyen is not a candidate for the European Parliament. I think that would have been more sanitary in a way. But the other groups also bear a responsibility. Yes, I can be openly critical here of Renew. I think they messed up completely. With they did it last time with their Spitzenteam, and they have it again. It's complete. They have complete. It's like if you go to a national election, you don't say, well, here we have a team of 10 candidates, and we'll tell you after the elections who is our candidate to be prime minister. Sorry, it doesn't work that way. Then the socialists, you're right about Commissioner Schmidt, but everybody knows that he is just no match for Ursula von der Leyen. So indeed, the other groups have a heavy responsibility there, because they themselves didn't understand the role of Parliament. And I think for a healthy democracy, we need not just a Parliament with more powers, but a Parliament which is actually keeping a check on the power of the European Commission. That's the essence of democracy. And another problem is what we see here, and which worries me a lot more, is the fact that the European Council, which, if you read the treaties, it says two things about the European Council. One, it has no legislative powers. That's explicit in the treaties. And two, it's supposed to set out a vision, strategy for the development of the European Union. Basically, it's a think tank. It's a bit like SEPS, really. Okay, but it's not a government, and yet it behaves like a government. And the European Parliament, has no formal powers in scrutinizing it or holding it to account. But we have not given sufficient counterweight to that development, and you can see that the whole institutional construction is increasingly skewed, and I think that's unhealthy for democracy.
There's one point, though, I have to disagree with you, that without transnational, I mean, if she was on the ballots in Lower Saxony, that wouldn't make a big difference, I think, von der Leyen, I mean, right? If she was on the ballots of one out of 16 countries in Germany, out of 27 member states, you know, what is it, 6 million?
Sorry, this is the way, this is what's happening in lots of countries, like the one I'm running in Belgium. I mean, even, or in the UK, okay, they're out now, but I mean, there are these systems where the political leader has to be elected in a constituency, which usually works.
Yeah, but it's 6 million people. I think without transnational list, that argument whether she's running for a seat in the parliament or not is really technocratic to me, it seems.
I think the issue behind is the following. The Lisbon Treaty changed the procedure for the election of the Commission President in 3 ways. A, Parliament elects the Commission President. It's not confirming or approving a choice, it elects. So the moment of election is in the European Parliament. Secondly, the European Council makes a proposal in view of the outcome of the European elections. And third, the European Council has to consult with the European Parliament before it makes that proposal. So the text was changed 3 times, and governments concluded that nothing should change. That's ruled out, that's impossible. The Spitzenkandidaten was not a necessary conclusion of the treaty change, but it was absolutely a possible conclusion of the treaty change. The sense of the treaty change is a different balance between the election, the European Parliament coming out, and the European Council, and not just give the right de facto to decide for the European Council, give a real say for the European Parliament. And that's the chance of the Spitzenkandidaten. It's a historical process. We will see how it's happening now. But my bet is you will also see it at the next election.
Can I add?
Yes, of course,
No,
Eddie.
okay. No, I just wanted to say, even if we were seeing the Spitzenkandidat process in action right now, you probably wouldn't see that many, you know, imagining we had Schmidt and we have von der Leyen doing their campaigns around Europe. I mean, it needs to, so many more things need to change. The very nature of Europe and the very nature of politics across the EU needs to fundamentally change before, and that could be through legislation, through transnational lists coming in, through a kind of concretization, you know, in law of the Spitzenkandidat process. But however it is, I mean, the actual campaigns that these politicians are running are so bare bones and so just, they're not seen at all. I mean, there's 2 debates in Brussels this week. Why are there 2 debates happening in Brussels? Why not have one in Strasbourg? Why is the FT not holding one, I don't know, in Paris? I mean, it's because people ultimately aren't that interested, I mean, in the European elections. It is a bubble, it's a bubble topic. They're interested in the elections insofar as the elections happening in their country, but they are not following von der Leyen's campaign, where she's mostly not talking to actual people, she's talking to leaders in these countries.
Of the EPP. What is your overall take on the campaigns? From what, I mean, from my perspective, it looks like EPP, von der Leyen is only visiting EPP countries. Schmidt is campaigning but has no chance anyhow. And the rest is not really leaving their home countries. Is that a bit too much?
I mean, Schmidt, you know, in fairness to him, he's galvanizing, you know, socialist members and socialist parties across Europe. He's going a lot to Italy. I mean, he is playing a role that I suppose is helpful to those socialist parties, whether they're in opposition. Well, they mostly are in opposition now across Europe. So I mean, you know, he's 70 years old and he's traveling, you know, constantly for the last couple of months. So it's not nothing. I just think it's mostly something that's directed at his base and at the socialist base, rather than, you know, like a Timmermans-style campaign last time, which really was, hey, I'm Franz Timmermans, I speak 300 languages, and I'm going to be the Commission President.
Yeah, well, it was easier for him, I guess. Yeah, Sophie.
No, because there are 2 elements here. One, first of all, at some point, I think citizens are going to protest, because I think you know, it's insane that we are 2024 and people seem to accept that the next political leader of the European Commission or the European Union is going to be chosen before the elections have actually taken place. I mean, where do you see that? In what democracy? I mean, first there have to be elections and then you negotiate. And the fact that the negotiations and talks are taking place before the elections is unacceptable. And at some point people will rebel. Secondly, because you say people don't care and there's no interest. Well, you know, they've also been told that it's all not very interesting. and that's very boring. And I also find, and okay, you can never blame the media, but I'm going to be a bit critical nevertheless. I mean, everybody knows every single detail of the American elections. Everything. I wish that if the media were only to spend, let's say, 5% of the coverage that they give to the American elections, which are, of course, very, very important, but then maybe people would be a bit better informed and a bit more interested. And maybe then the candidates would also be more, have a stronger incentive to actually go out and campaign.
Maybe if von der Leyen
Wasn't addressed at you, huh?
maybe if von der Leyen was on trial, then there'd be more interest, and maybe she will be. No, that's a joke. Although, no, but seriously, I'm not going to play the company card, but I do think that look, I've been covering this election very intensely for like months, and
I wasn't blaming you.
No, I know, and
I
I agree with you, because I wish there was more interest, outside Brussels, in these elections, but I just can't. I'm not picking it up.
Yeah, it's more about the national media, I guess, right? Than the.
I don't agree with that, I have to say. It's not true that there's no interest in this, in the elections or in the campaign. I just give you a figure from the 2019 elections. We had in the Parliament 300,000 European citizens who registered with the European Parliament because they wanted to go out and campaign. They were asking for material across the board. Not the case in 2014. The early figures we have for participation now are that people likely or very likely to vote. The figure is 10% up compared to last time. I'm not saying participation will finally be 10% up, but we had something similar, and last time it was 8% up. So we went from a low of 42 now to above 50, and we could go well higher up in the 50s. And I think this is the reason for, the reason are three. First, I think, is personalization, because it gives a lot of cost-free media coverage. Even if we are not happy with von der Leyen, people say that we are not happy with von der Leyen or with the choice. The second point is that when I started to be interested in European issues 30 years ago, it was very much kind of technical stuff, the internal market. How did it concern me? Very difficult to say. Now we are discussing COVID, we are discussing Ukraine, we are discussing Russia, we are discussing, people's issues which touch people directly, and that's why they're coming out. And the third thing is that the parties of the extreme right are reaching out to people who traditionally didn't vote. So, and that's, at least to that extent, we found something positive here. So my expectation is that people will bother much more than in the past, and that we will very likely see rising participation in these elections.
All right, we have to move on a little bit, because I really would like to also speak a bit about transparency and corruption, but I do want to give you guys a chance. So if there's somebody that promises me a short question, one short, snappy question. No one?
Only long questions.
Okay, please, yeah, exactly. Long question, no. Please introduce yourself.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Matteo from the Council of the EU. It's a complicated one, but I'll try to make it short. Cordon sanitaire. If the far-right surge we're all sort of predicting happens, materializes, we think it could be about 25% of the seats. Will ECR and ID remain out of the game for the key posts and all that involves the committee chairs, the vice president, etc., etc.? And that might be also in relation with the election of the Commission President, I guess, the role that ECR may or may not play in that respect.
Yeah, very interesting question, and we just talked about it a little bit. Would you like to give an answer to that?
Okay, I don't have responsibility in the new parliament, surely not. But in this parliament, ID was outside, ECR was not outside. So ECR people were elected to committees, they were also elected. They have a vice president of parliament, for example. And what is the reason behind? I think the reason behind is that there is a difference on the spectrum to the right of the EPP. There are those who try to destroy the system, and are those who have different views on immigration and other things. And for me, that makes a difference. For me, Le Pen, also Wilders, also Vlaams Belang, also the AfD, and this is not a final list, they try to they try to destroy the system. And the system is the general readiness to cooperate in Europe. They are rather friends of Russia, which increasingly matters as well. And for me, they are raising questions on parliamentary democracy. And that makes a difference. But I would like to add one thing here. There's a lot of talk on the rising of a populist right, but it's remained nearly unnoticed that we also have the rise of a populist left. And that's, but but we could be surprised. We could be surprised because in Germany we have the Wagenknecht party polling at about 7%. They are combining kind of the social and the nationalist. If we are thinking of Slovakia, yeah, it is scary. If we are thinking of Slovakia, the governing parties try to combine the social and the nationalist. I don't know where exactly to situate the Five-Star Movement, which didn't find a home in the last parliament, maybe for some reasons. If you add these three parties together, they are good for about 30 seats. You add a couple of smaller ones here and there, you have a new political group in the European Parliament. So you can come to a social and nationalist policy position from a starting position on the right, but you can also come to a social and nationalist policy position from a starting point on the very left.
And I've heard that Bündnis Sarah Wagenknecht and the Five-Star Movement, they could even find common ground. Sophie, from the inside, what do you think on the far right? And maybe clearly the distinction between the ID and the ECR from your perspective when it comes to parliamentary work.
Well, for me, that distinction is extremely subtle. So subtle that I sometimes don't see it, because you mentioned a couple of parties, but you said there are other parties in those two families. I suppose you mainly mean ECR, which are reasonable. I can only think of the Flemish nationalists. All the others. Okay. All right. We get a little bit to, what did the Romans ever do for us? But no, I think the difference is marginal between the two groups. And there are lots of forces in the ECR which I think are, very difficult, if not impossible, to work with. And somebody like Meloni may, she may be a civilized face in the European Council, but she's definitely not at national level. So, and I think the big problem here is the EPP. Because the EPP, S&D, and to an extent the Liberals and the Greens have always formed broad majorities, very stable majorities, and it would be center-left, center-right. It would not be extreme left and extreme right. But this flirtation with the EPP, with the far right, I think is very, very dangerous. And I think they're using it, Weber is just using it to put pressure on the center-left in order to extract certain concessions. But I think he's playing with fire. I think we have seen, in my country of origin, we see what that has come to. We now have a good friend of Viktor Orban, who's the biggest party in the Netherlands. People haven't yet, it hasn't sunk in yet. But Orban is his friend. Putin is his friend. Marine Le Pen is his friend. Those are the people that he is looking at and saying they're doing a really, really good job. What makes us think that these people, once they're in power in a country like the Netherlands, are going to behave differently? So, I always hear, in particular in Germany, this talk about the Chinese wall, the Chinese wall. What on earth does that mean? If you're embracing the discourse and the philosophy of the far right, then the Chinese wall is only between two clans, if you want. Then it's only about mathematics, and who wants to be in power. At some point, you have to draw a line in the sand and say, and this is why I'm very happy, as I said earlier, that Valérie Ayer has said, for a party that is in coalition with the far right, even if it's the VVD, which has been in the Liberal family for, I don't know, half a century. There's just no place for them. And I think you have to be clear, because we've, and this is the last thing I'm going to say. Why did the Wilders Party, or at what point did the Wilders Party started to grow? It was after the VVD leader said publicly that she didn't exclude a coalition with Wilders, and almost immediately he shot up in the polls.
Meloni kind of made a case of a leader that moderated after taking over power, right?
She's not moderate. Sorry,
Eddie.
she's not moderate.
Eddie.
Well, I was interested in picking up on what Sophie was saying about this kind of blurring of the lines between ECR and ID, and I think that there is this kind of invisible line, as what Klaus was saying before, that the Parliament, when it comes to the Cordon Sanitaire, ECR is, technically is not covered by the Cordon Sanitaire. However, some parts of ECR are kind of covered by it. The Law and Justice Party, they're not being given, spots in the bureau where, the €2 billion a year budget is decided on, nor are they being given committee chairs, and they've been blocked from those. So there has already been a kind of invisible line. Now what we're seeing with Manfred Weber, the EPP leader, is, he's being attacked, for considering opening up, other parts of the ECR which are growing, which he clearly thinks should not be, on the other side of that invisible line. But I think that the two hard right, far right, nationalist right groups are making it more difficult as well for people to kind of draw a clear line between them, because of the kind of horse trading and deals that have been happening over the last few years. Not only is Vox, which is extremely basically neo-fascist party in Spain, extremely far right party, they're in ECR, and then this weekend we saw who was turning up at their rally in Madrid. Marine Le Pen. So what's going on there? Also Meloni. So it is. I take Sophie's point that it's blurred, but it's also, I think the question of Ukraine is an extremely important delineating factor there. And there's an academic, Cass Mudder, who basically says that what's important now, when centre-right parties decide whether to cooperate with these far-right parties or parties further to the right, isn't really about what do they say about migration, what do they say about women, what do they say about minorities' rights. It's where do they stand on Ukraine, and that's to a certain extent how Meloni has managed to become acceptable and to get to put one foot into the establishment of Europe, is by saying, okay, I'm not going to stop sending weapons to Ukraine. I'm not going to start inflaming the rhetoric about Ukrainians in Europe, and we gotta have peace instead of war, and all this kind of stuff that the far right says, and that's how she's managed to become a bit more. So that's actually a really interesting dividing line on the far right, and maybe there isn't that much difference in terms of policy between some parts of ECR and ID, but for the time being, the spectre of Orban, the last thing I'll say, the spectre of Orban haunting the ECR group, because he has his 12 MEPs who are not sitting anywhere after they got into a fight with the EPP in 2021 and left the EPP group. So I think that would be a tectonic shift. I think some parties in ECR, which has traditionally styled itself with the British Conservatives being part of it, very pro-transatlantic, very pro-Ukraine. There's now parts of that group that would freak out totally if Orban comes in.
Yeah, and they've threatened also to leave the group, some of them, right? The Finns, for instance. Is there anything that you would like to add on the far right, Sophie?
No,
Briefly,
a little bit.
please.
It's not even. I mean, there I agree with Klaus. It's not even far right, or there's also far left, or whatever you want to call it. But we have seen that the European Council and the government leaders have gained a lot more weight and power over the years, since the Lisbon Treaty, but in particular in the last 5 years. And it seems that the demarcation line is between those who behave well in the Council and they get away with anything in the European Council, and those who do not behave, because Viktor Orban is, he's just being very rude and loud and pissing everybody off. But all the other government leaders are also, they're not loudly threatening to wield a veto, but they're also extracting concessions and wheeling. And this is how you see people like Meloni, but also Mitsotakis, sorry, I have to say it here, who are destroying the rule of law. I mean, Meloni attacking the free media now, attacking women's rights, attacking LGBTI rights, trying to consolidate her power position with constitutional changes, and she gets away with it because she's being good inside the European Council.
And also because there cannot be a cordon sanitaire in those institutions because the mode is negotiation, so you cannot exclude.
Yeah, but this is the problem with the European Council. You see.
But look, Sophie, we have to move in here. So I'm sorry. We do another session on the European Council, I promise. But we have 10 minutes left, and I would love to speak a little bit about Quatargate and what happened, because I know that Eddie really got his head around there. So 1.5 years ago, Quatargate, the Parliament came up with new internal rules about transparency and so on. We have now a new ethics body across the institutions. Yeah, I already see Sophie rolling her eyes. Yet they are surfacing these scandals, right, about espionage from Russia and China. Eddie, where do we stand? Where does the European Parliament stand? And is a future corruption scandal, can it be prevented with the measures that we're taking now?
No. Definitely not. However, the challenge, to be fair to the Parliament, which has, I suppose, tried at least to give some kind of political response to this crisis. Although I think it's mostly out of fear of what people would think about them if they had no response. The Parliament is in a tough spot. I mean, it's a huge institution, thousands of staff members, 8,000 staff, hundreds of MEPs. Obviously, they can't keep tabs on what everyone's doing, but they could make some more effort than they are at the moment. So we've had Quatargate, which obviously involved Mauritania and Morocco. Now we're seeing Russian spies, potentially Chinese spies, potentially working as assistants to MEPs. So the Parliament is a giant target for foreign interference. And I don't think that any of the 14 points that Roberta Metsola brought up were even designed really to focus on that. They were mostly about nips and tucks and tightening, particular kind of record-taking measures, and about how do you organize events in the Parliament. You have to sign a particular register when you enter. It was as if Quatargate was a story about bad lobbyists, lobbyists kind of coming in with bags of cash and trying to buy people off. Actually, what Quatargate was about, and obviously we've got to remember that it's yet to go to trial, and it may all well collapse a few months later this year. But it was actually about foreign interference. It was about governments or people extremely well connected in governments and secret services from countries outside the EU getting people to do their bidding for huge amounts of money in the European Parliament. And there's nothing that the Parliament has really done apart from say, corruption is a crime, and we can't stop people being criminals if they want to be criminals.
Is the European Parliament a more popular target for foreign interference, Klaus?
First, I would like to say I fully agree with you. The measures were an answer, but not to the question of Quatargate. Because Quatargate is the question. Foreign governments put hundreds of thousands of euros into the apartments of individual people. That's the question in times of geopolitical tensions incredibly rising. And second, not everybody who claims to be a good lobby is a good lobby. Because this was fighting impunity, so we all thought this is a wonderful case, but it wasn't. So on this, no answer. The real thing is we would need a functioning system of security services in the European Union. When I was Secretary General, I got the first time some kind of indications, maybe 5 years before I left office. Before, nobody cared. Basically, the European institutions are left without defense against Russia, against China, against Iran, and against all kinds of other countries. But we are in a geopolitical battle. We are lucky if the probably very small Belgian service does something, but it's not enough. And therefore, we will need another scandal and another scandal and another scandal before member states are finally ready to give us the competences and the structures we need. And I can say in the last budget I proposed as Secretary General, I asked for 12 posts for security exactly for this. Budget I proposed in the beginning of 2022, far before Quatargate. And it was a scandal. And the Council was outraged about this kind of waste. But if there's not a minimum kind of personnel structure available with experience that can counter these kind of efforts, we are just defenseless, and we are still completely defenseless in a times of war in the European continent. I mean, it's incredible.
Sophia.
Well, first, maybe a little joke. I mean, the fact that the European Parliament is a target shows how important it really is. You know, it's good knowledge for the 9th of June. Some people who say, "Oh, this European Parliament is indeed it's not a real parliament." But no, I have to say I'm not so sure that there are quick fixes here, unless because I don't know if the most important differences will be made by 12 staff, more or less. The problem is that we don't have a European security service. I mean, for example, if we as members of the European Parliament want to get access to certain documents for which we need security clearance, we can't, because you can only get security clearance by your national authorities. There is no European authority, first of all. So, you know, who's going to do that? Who's going to check? And secondly, I think there is a big debate that we should have about how open and is the European Parliament going to be? How free are its members and its staff going to be? And on the other hand, what kind of measures do you need to take to keep us secure and safe from? Because, for example, all these proposals to have all sorts of security checks on and accountability requirements for staff. If I think of assistants who are actually very often in a very weak position vis-a-vis their MEPs, to then also somehow, you know, expose them, I find that very difficult. As a member of parliament, I mean, on the one hand, I'm very much in favor of the lobby register and indeed all sorts of security measures. On the other hand, you know, I also feel it's important I have the freedom to speak with people, even if they're not in the lobby register. I mean, not so long ago, we wanted to organize a meeting with the Association of Polish Judges. I mean, you can hardly, you know, suspect them of being terrorists or something. And it was impossible because they hadn't registered. Well, why would they register? They've never lobbied the European Parliament. Or shortly after the invasion of Ukraine, I met with an organization, a Russian organization for LGBTI rights. Am I going to register that? Hell no. Because, you know, or our inquiry into spyware. I would have not been able to do that if I had to register every single phone call or cup of coffee that I had, not least because there were some people on the committee that, you know, that didn't want anything brought to light. So it's going to be very difficult. Where is that line? And then finally, because Eddie, you said almost as a reproach, like, but I think it's true. If people really want to be bribed, they will be bribed. Yeah. You cannot legislate against bad intention. They'll find the loopholes somehow.
Then
lobby rules.
Why are they still voting then? Why are they? I understand at that point, but then I think the general, you know, voter or person looking at the European Parliament would then ask, why is, for example, Eva Kaili obviously not proven guilty yet, or maybe never, but, you know, why is someone like that turning up in the Parliament month after month? Yeah. That's something that the Parliament could do.
I'm not sure that we could legally. I don't think so.
Not now, not under the current system, but.
Yeah, but the point is, if you look at the rules which are governing the European Parliament and the status of the members, etc., it's very largely national legislation. So, and also, I mean, as you rightfully pointed out yourself, I mean, it was the Belgian authorities that brought this case to light. There isn't some sort of European FBI. I would very much want there to be one. We actually have Europol, which is, you know, every time you're asking them to look into this kind of issues, they're hiding under the table. But another one, and there's a difference also, because so we had Quatargate, which is a case of people being bribed. I always wonder, by the way, why do people pay, you know, hundreds of thousands or even millions for one vote in the European Parliament? Okay, but and then we have, of course, Chinese and Russian spying. But there's one interesting case, and that is that we have been several times that MEPs, top MEPs, including Roberta Metsola, have been targeted with spyware, and that has been completely swept under the carpet, completely. And then I wonder, because this is, I mean, the national governments, again, sorry to come back to them, but you know, they know about this and they have relationships that all they need to do is give a phone call to the Israeli government and say, can you please tell us, you know, you have given an export license to NSO for Pegasus, you have the phone numbers of the people who've been targeted, you know who ordered the stuff, you know who bought it, give us the information, and they're not doing it.
We have to come to a close, but Eddie, I understand now that the measures that were put in place, they don't help to fight corruption, but do they at least make things more transparent when it comes, for instance, to lobbyism that was necessary? Is there some
I think so, but I think if the rules had been followed during before these 14 points, we wouldn't have got to this thing either. I mean, the European Parliament itself signed, you know, the European Parliament Research Service did sign an agreement with Fight Impunity. Obviously, I'm not saying that the Parliament at the time knew, you know, what was really going on at that NGO or the person running it, what he was up to, Antonio Panzeri. But I mean, if the letter of the law had actually been followed, I mean, it seems like there's a lot of, you know, thirst for legislating and coming up with new rules, and I understand that politically we journalists are asking, what are you going to do? Where's your plan? You know, Roberta Metsola, what are you going to, you know, how are you going to respond? But also the boring stuff needs to be done as well. If you actually want to fight corruption, you need to check that people coming into the Subcommittee on Human Rights, to take one example, are actually in the transparency register.
Right. Klaus, last words. You don't have to make them big. On transparency and corruption. Or you've said everything you wanted to share? Okay, wonderful. Well, then I would say thank you very much to our speakers for being here and discussing these important questions with us. Thanks for you for coming to SEPS despite the rain. And we have our third EP elections events on 5th of June, where we're going to look into how several member states are looking at these elections. Have a lovely afternoon. Goodbye, everyone.